very reluctant to read this because I don't want to keep. This is about Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby is the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, who killed the president. I don't believe it was a conspiracy. I believe that Oswald and Jack Ruby were really, really disturbed people. And if you do even light research on them, I just don't see how anybody couldn't come to the same conclusion. That doesn't mean disturbed people couldn't be part of some remarkable conspiracy that they got away with. I guess they could be, but neither one of them, by the way, was. They weren't the sharpest knives in the drawer, people. But with that said, let me give you an example of Jack Ruby. Aside from these severe beatings he gave to people for almost no reason, I mean, you could look at this guy the wrong way. He masturbated. He loved dogs. He masturbated his dog. This is in the Warren report. Masturbated his dog on a bar in front of his friend. He said it relaxed the dog. Well, it relaxes anybody, but still, you don't do that sort of. It's abnormal behavior. I will say though, within this report that I wrote, I did a lot of time researching this, and I tried to connect him to every bad guy I could find. A lot of you who follow this, especially you Chicago people, you'll know these names. These aren't small time hoods. These are big time hoods. Um, so did they put him up to it? I don't think so, man. I think Jack Ruby was one of these guys. He carried a pistol all the time. And I think for a lot of reasons, he carried a lot of money with him. He was in a strip tease bar business, the scumbag element. And he carried the gun with him. He was a spur of the moment guy, and I really think in his brain he thought he would be a hero. So that's my opinion. Anyway, here we go. It's a twist of fate that's the Chicago outfit's assault on the city's labor union in the late 1930s, labor unions in the 1930s, would be the eventual cause of driving Jack Ruby out of Chicago's West Side to Dallas, Texas, and into infamy, actually. Chicago's crowded West Side, this is when he was a boy, it had 50,000 residents per square mile. That's thick. It was home to some of Chicago's most colorful but poverty-stricken ethnic enclaves, including this large Jewish population, one of the largest in North America at that time. Jack Rubenstien, Jack Ruby, his given name, was Rubenstien, was born in the Lawndale district near Maxwell Street. I went there with a friend of mine who's a Chicago policeman, and in my brain I had Lawndale as Maxwell Street from like the 1920s and 40s. Of course, it looks nothing like that at all now, but a little bit of a disappointment. I thought it would look different. It's a very modernized. Some of the buildings I think are old enough to have been part of the legacy. Anyway, Ruby's childhood years were a fitting portrait of a life in Lawndale. His father, among the poor. His father, Joseph, was abusive. He was a heavy drinker who beat his much younger wife, Fanny Rokowsky, beat her up fairly regularly. The couple had been tossed together in an arranged marriage. That was commonplace in her native Poland in the Jewish community. Fanny Rubenstien, Jack's mother, was a woman, she was plagued with her own demons. She often beat him up and the other children. I don't mean slap him around, I mean beat him up. And she was abusive, verbally abusive, which I think hurts a hell of a lot more than a slap in the face because it lasts a lot longer. So she was a quick-tempered redhead. She was the daughter of respected doctors, but she was completely uneducated. She was crude. She was emotional. Eventually, unable to control her outbursts, she was committed to a series of mental asylums, causing the family to break apart when Jack was just 10 years old. So the first 10 years of his life were some kind of a living hell. Although he lived on and off with his mother when she wasn't hospitalized, in fairness, still, a child with a woman like that ain't good. Ruby seldom attended school, and as a result, he flunked out of the third grade. He later claimed to have finished the eighth grade. He didn't. Instead, Ruby and his childhood friend, the great Barney Ross, a boxer, a hell of a fighter, a prize fighter, who was also a war hero, they'd go. He'd be a. There's several films about him you might want to see. They were street hustlers, so they were scalping sports tickets, doing anything else they could really to turn a buck, and they ran numbers for Al Capone's minions. Occasionally, they were delivering payoff envelopes to the police, prosecutors. Ruby grew into this tough kid. Well, you can imagine his pal is Barney Ross, for God's sake. And he earned a reputation as an awesome street brawler who, win or lose, he never backed down. He took as many beatings as he gave out. He just had no fear. I read, it was a guy who knew him as a kid, a teenager, so you could punch Ruby all day long. He wouldn't go down and he wouldn't quit. Anyway, in 1923, under a court order, Ruby, his brothers and sisters, were taken from his parents' care. And they were submitted to the care of foster homes, which are, I can tell you firsthand, living fucking nightmares for several years, but foster homes didn't change him really very much. He still roamed the streets, he fought, he got into a lot of trouble. In 1933, Ruby and several other teens from the neighborhood traveled to California, and they ended up in San Francisco. And they were selling horse racing tip sheets at mob-owned tracks. It doesn't make sense these days, but it was a big deal back then. It was a moneymaker too. It was here where he became maybe involved with the outfit's little known but very lucrative marijuana smuggling operation out of Mexico and into Los Angeles. You ever have time on your hands, I highly recommend for you guys in Chicago, look into Chicago's dealings with marijuana along the border. There's a lot going on there. Giancana lived at the border for a while. They had guys down there. Anyway, that I think in their view, marijuana and dope were just two different things. So they did have, especially under RICA, an anti-dope rule, but yeah, I just don't think they saw marijuana as the same thing. Ruby returned to Chicago in 1937. He became involved with the Scrap Iron and Junk Handlers Union, Local 20467, where he worked for $22.50 a week. That wasn't bad pay, but he got a commission for as many when he got people to join the thing. So officially, he was a union organizer. That was his role. Ruby's friend and his mentor, Leon Cook, he was a lawyer. His Cook's chief goal was to raise wages for the membership, to do something more so they'd make something a little bit more reasonable than 15 cents an hour that they were making. By the end of the late 1930s, 15 cents an hour, even at that point, is a cent. By the late 1930s, labor plundering was the Chicago outfit's chief source of income. They'd lost prohibition. Prostitution is more trouble than it's worth, so they turned to unions. So when Johnny Martin, who was a small-time hustler, is associated with the Chicago's leading syndicate guy, Murray Humphreys, he came to Humphreys for permission to take over the Scrap Iron Workers Union. And Humphreys, of course, gave him permission because he'd get a cut and so on and so forth. Within a day or so, Martin, with the mob behind him, had moved in on the union and appointed himself president. It was that simple. At the time, Martin was also the city of Chicago's, he was on their payroll as a sanitary district clerk and was under indictment with mob boss Paul Ricca for trying to hide taxable income from the federal government. Jack Ruby, although hired by Cook, he fell under Martin's command and was made the syndicate's bagman inside the union. So did he do it by choice? Because he's supposed to have been Leon Cook. He thought Leon Cook was God and so forth. So I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. If a mob guy comes up to you and you don't have a lot of options and he says, you're going to be the bagman, what are you going to do? Argue with him? You could quit. How are you going to eat? So there could be that. But I don't think it is. Ruby had this thing about authority. Look at his life. Whenever authority came to him, he was like a chameleon. He changed to whatever the authority was at the time. Anyway, as for Leon Cook, no one's really sure what happened, except they know that there was a power struggle within the union, and Cook was shot dead. From what police were able to reconstruct, Cook barged into Martin's office. He told him he wanted him out of the union now. Martin argued. After a few minutes, Martin drew a revolver and he shot Cook 3 times in the back. And then he took the only witness to the shooting, the office secretary, as hostage, and he fled down the back stairs of the building. Eventually, Martin was arrested and released, of course, claiming self-defense, although he couldn't explain, nor did the state's attorney's office ask why, if it was self-defense. Why'd you shoot him in the back 3 times? Anyway, for the few days after the shooting, Ruby was the primary suspect in this incident. You can go back to newspapers.com, look it up, and they mention he's called Rubenstien, not Ruby. He was even picked up and questioned by the police about his role in the murder, but they released him after 2 hours of questioning. Later, in this odd twist of fate, Robert Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, Attorney General Kennedy, reinvestigated Ruby's role in Leon Cook's killing for the McClellan Committee. Kennedy concluded that Ruby played no role in the murder. So, isn't that interesting? Because he would later go and their lives would intertwine. He also noted that Cook County State's Attorney, Chief Investigator, Tubbo Gilbert, who was notoriously corrupt, moved in on the Union shortly after the shooting and confiscated all the Union records and charges. These documents, along with police records pertaining to the Cook shooting, Kennedy noted, disappeared forever. And so Jack Ruby's real position within the Union will never be known. Well, I was going to tell you, but after Leon Cook's murder, Jack Ruby roamed the streets. He started telling people he intended to take over the Union, but of course, it was all talk. A lot of things about Jack Ruby were all talk, and people who research these things, who ought to know better, this Kennedy said, Ruby was out of his mind. He said, "I'm going to take over the Union." Well, he's not going to take over the Chicago mobs. Murray Humphreys running them. Jack Ruby, this whack job is going to take. But researchers they say, "Oh my God, he must have been powerful." No, he was a. Anyway, I wanted to just tell you, by the way, Tubbo Gilbert, this punk who was the chief investigator, he was known as the world's richest cop. He was incredibly corrupt guy, just incredibly corrupt guy. When I wrote my book about Roger Toohey, Gilbert plays a big role in that. He arranged, really, I think he was the pusher behind Toohey's guilty conviction. Toohey was guilty of a lot of things, but not as guilty as Tubbo made him out to be. Anyway, the syndicate had its own plan for the Junk Handlers Union. It was renamed the Waste Handlers Material Local 20467 from the AFL, American Federation of Labor, in 1939. And guess who moved in? Paul Dorfman, who was a scary guy. He's one of the chief's syndicate's late racketeer. He moved into the operation, which caused the AFL-CIO to dub it largely a shakedown operation. Dorfman's stepson, Alan Dorfman, would later get involved with the whole Teamsters deal of, doling out money so they could build casinos. Ruby stayed with the Union as a bagman under Dorfman for several more months. He admitted he was a bagman for several more months before leaving work with Ben Zuckerman, Zookie the Bookie. He was a gambling big shot. He was a power in the 24th Ward, which I think, from what I'm told, the 24th Ward then and what it is, there are two different places that got chopped up. And he was connected with Dago, Lawrence Mangano, as a mafia hood with high ambitions. Zuckerman was murdered, of course, by the mob in 1944. Mangano met the same fate. Years later, congressional investigators wrongly assumed that Ruby was run out of Chicago by Lenny Patrick for operating one of Zookie's handbooks on Patrick's territory without permission, and Patrick gave Ruby 24 hours to clear out of town. It's an impressive story, one that Ruby often told himself. He self-grandized a lot, but it probably wasn't true. Like most syndicate hoods, Patrick was concerned with making money. He wouldn't have had run Ruby out of town. A handbook's a handbook, and a good handbook operator is hard to find. It's a complicated job. It's not as easy as it sounds. Instead, he would have just left Ruby alone, give him a warning maybe, and then put him to work on the usual 60-40 split. If Ruby was run out of Chicago, it was probably because he wasn't a producer, a moneymaker, because he was skimming from the take that he was supposed to give Patrick. That's possible too. But all the evidence points to Ruby not having been chased out of Chicago by anybody. He just left. In 1947, Ruby followed his sister Eva down to Dallas, where she opened a nightclub restaurant called the Singapore Social Club. She borrowed that name from a mob hangout on Rush Street, the Singapore. It was a notorious mob place. After Ruby bought the place, he changed the name to the Silver Slipper. Again, a place on Rush Street, short-lived place on Rush Street. So Ruby reappeared in Chicago in 1949. his name showed up on a list of potential informants willing to work with the Kefauver committee when it was in Chicago. The committee's lawyer, Lou Kuttner, who was a sharp guy, was accused of accepting $60,000 to make sure the committee didn't call any Chicago mob leaderships to testify on any specific issues. He arranged for Ruby to meet with Kuttner arranged for Ruby to meet with the committee's chief counsel, Rudolph Haley. Haley noted to Kefauver that, quote, Ruby is a syndicate lieutenant who had been sent to Dallas to serve as a liaison for Chicago mobsters, and that, quote again, Ruby was the payoff man for the Dallas Police Department. You know, there's nothing to back that up. And the guy who gave him this information was Lou Kuttner. Kuttner's basically a thief. He's getting paid off by the mobs. I mean, they could have blown Ruby up to be this gigantic gangster, and whatever information he gave him about inside workings of the Chicago mob, which he no doubt would have made up. Because what does he know? He's in Dallas. They take his Bible truth. That's my view on it. But your other choice is to believe that this clown, Ruby, is a lieutenant for the Chicago mob in Texas. And anyway, as unlikely as all that might be, Ruby failed to provide the committee with any information, which caused Haley to suspect that the hood, with Kuttner's knowledge, had been set up, as I said. A few years after Ruby left Chicago for Dallas, gangster Sam Giancana took over the policy racket in Chicago's enormous black ghettos. I'm thinking South Side. I get confused with that, but I think it is. The mob began to understand just how much money there was in this. In the black neighborhoods, they were playing penny nickel gambling. It wasn't a lot of money, but you add it up, it's a lot of money. There's a lot of people putting a penny here, a penny there. I don't want to get too far off of this, but there was a great Irish hero named O'Connell, who was not Catholic. He was an Irishman, but he was a Protestant. And he wanted to get the British the hell out of Ireland. So he held rallies, and he realized that the way to get people to feel a part of this, they had something called a half a penny. You could, believe it or not, you could give a half a penny. And he took only half a penny. You couldn't give more, you couldn't give less, you know. So these rallies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, which terrified the British throne. But when people gave that little bit of money, there was a sense of belonging. There was a sense of being a part of something, you see? So it was a bright move. Anyway, with this nickel and dime stuff, the black people in Chicago who gambled on this thing, they had favorite numbers they would run, favorite wheels, the thing it wasn't actually a wheel, that they'd spin, and one was the buffalo and gravy. They just had ridiculous names that really didn't have anything to do with the game. But, they liked the sound of it, or a certain number, or you had a dream. And they were loyal to these things because they'd given their money there. And by the way, the black numbers that were run by, I can't remember their names, brothers, black guys in Chicago, were honest. I mean, they never cheated. They always paid out when they had to. They understood, if we're going to go on long term, pay. And they did. Anyway, so Giancana, he's inspired by this fortune he sees coming out of the poorest neighborhoods. And the outfit told him, go in, capture the policy racket on a citywide basis. Before the end of 1946, the Chicago outfit's gambling arm was active in Ohio, Kansas, Indiana, Michigan, and they had their eye on Dallas. It was a logical move for the outfit. Dallas was a wide open city, it was a rich city, always had been a rich city, that supported enormous gambling and prostitution rackets. It was mostly run by freelancers. The mob paved the way for a takeover by corrupting Will Wilson. He was the district attorney in Dallas, and through Eddie Vogel, one of Capone's old slot machine guys, distributors, he put up $168,000, Vogel did, of mob money to help elect Governor Buford Jester. The hell kind of a name, Buford Jester. Anyway, Arcotto, see, I pronounced it right that way, wanted to make sure that the Dallas County Sheriff, Steve Guthrie, was with them as well. So to find out, they set Pat Mano, who was a crew boss for Chicago's North Side, and two small-time fixtures at that time, Paul Jones, Jack Nappy. They sent them down to Texas, check out the situation. They were told, get in touch with Guthrie, bribe him so the mob could move in there and organize the city. One of the first things Jones did when he arrived in Dallas was to get in touch with Jack Ruby. Bear in mind, I've forgotten the year we're talking, 1940s or something. Dallas even now is a lovely city. It's just a wonderful city, but it's a small city. The core of it is small. It's a lot of residential, but so I should think that at this point, it's also very poor. Late 50s. It's also early 50s. It's still smaller. So how many guys you got running around from Chicago in Dallas? Jewish guys in Dallas at that time who, had touched elbows with mob guys. So why did he who the hell knows why? He later told the FBI, I'm talking about Jones, when they asked him why were you in contact with Ruby, he said he had been given assurances by a mobster named Jimmy Weinberg and Needle Nose Labriola that quote, Ruby is all right, he's with us. That's what he said. But it's more likely that Jones looked up Ruby because he had been doing business with his brother Hyman for decades. That's my guess. And he's not going to tell that to the FBI. By the way, Ruby's brother Hyman's a thief and he's with us. So in fact, but on the other hand, it is strange that he would blame two active mob guys. In fact, the week before he was arrested for trying to bribe Sheriff Guthrie, Jones arranged for Hyman Ruby to distribute 70 gallons of whiskey into the dry state of Oklahoma. While out on appeal, he had several meetings with Ruby's sister, Eva, whose boyfriend was involved in a bait and switch scam at the time. Both Eva and Hyman said they had known Jones since 1945, and federal agents suspected that Jones and Hyman operated an opium smuggling operation out of Mexico, and hauled them both in for questioning. Later that year, Jones was arrested for importing $1 million in 1945 currency worth of opium across the border at Piedras Negras. That's a city in Mexico, I would think. After a few days of following Sheriff Guthrie around town, Jones approached him on a golf course. There was some chit-chat, and he asked, how would you like to make some really big money? The sheriff said he was interested, and Jones promised him $150,000 a year if he would cooperate with the syndicate once it started to operate their slot machines, floating crap games in Dallas. But right after the game, Guthrie's an honest guy. He went to the Texas Rangers for help. They provided him with a recording device and a photo surveillance and so forth, and a team to watch over this. They collected enough information over the next few months to send each one of the hoods involved to prison for a decade. Guthrie said that during one of the meetings that Jones named Jack Ruby, whom he knew, Guthrie knew him, as the man who would be brought in to run the Dallas operation for the Chicago mob. Interesting. 2 days later, when Guthrie reported 2 decades later, when Guthrie reported to the Warren Commission, FBI agents were sent to retrieve the 4 tapes made of the conversation. But 2 of the tapes, including the one where Jones named Ruby as his contact man, are gone. They've never come back. They're disappeared. Guthrie knew Ruby, of course, which was probably why the hoods tossed his name into the bribery attempt. Here he said, anytime I wanted to find any member of the syndicate who was doing business in our city in Dallas, I just went to Jack Ruby at the Silver Slipper. So, there you have it, people. Take it for what you want. And then in 1963, he went into the Dallas police station and shot Jack Ruby.